In one of my previous videos, I talked about pods as it relates to your support team structure. Well, if you wanted to hear more about pods, today's video is for you. We're going to be talking about what they are, how to use them, how to break your team up into pods, and how to manage those teams as it pertains to your business. If you already use pods in your business, I'd love it if you drop a comment below. I'd love to hear how pods are working for your company. At one of my previous MSPs, we grew really, really fast. We closed a whole bunch of deals all of a sudden and added a whole bunch of new clients and quickly found out that it was frustrating our existing clients that they would call in and they wouldn't, get their guy. It was kind of a pretty common thing, or they felt like we were too big for them, or the idea that, they just weren't getting the quality of support any longer. After hearing this for a few weeks, we decided that it was time to do something different. So time to evolve our service team to meet the changing client dynamic that we had. So we decided to split into pods. We split into two main pods with a third of a shared service pod. And that was kind of how we started off with that. Each of our pods had one account manager assigned to it, one or two level ones and one or two level twos. It sort of depended on the needs of the client. We had a third pod, which was a shared pod. That pod had our dispatcher in it, that had our shared level 2 and a shared level 3, along with our knock teams. This setup worked out well for us for quite a while. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons we learned throughout the whole process and talk about how you might want to structure pods in your world if that's a thing that you need. I always like to start with why. So why pods? I've already explained it a little bit, but the idea here is that when you grow your business and if you don't have a ton of standardization and documentation and you're relying on your team to do things because they just know the client, it's tough to scale that out. It's tough to build that into a much bigger business. And then when you add a bunch of clients like we did, you have a situation where some clients might get pretty frustrated because you're relying on a tech because they just know something where it's not written down anyplace else, or that they call in for a relatively common thing for them, but your service desk doesn't understand how to handle it at the level 1 level. When that happens, you have a couple different choices. The first choice is you split into pods, right? That's exactly what we did. The second is to work quickly on standardizing things. The problem is that standardizing things, if you've let it go for a while, at this point we had, I don't know, somewhere in that 100 clients or something. We had some standards, but we didn't have the standards fully built out. And it wasn't just a thing where we could spend a week on some documentation and call it good. We ended up having to shift into pods, and it worked out well for us. Now, the second question is how? How do you switch into pods? How do you figure out which client goes to which team and all those kinds of things? The easy way for us was that we actually had a couple different account managers and they had relatively similar books of business. And we kind of just split it that way. We said account manager 1, you're in pod 1, and account manager 2, you're in pod 2. One of the things that you could do if you don't have multiple account managers, or if it's all owner-led, or it's unbalanced or whatever, is go by number of endpoints or by revenue that they're bringing in, right? So the idea being that you have two pods that have relatively equal amount of work. That's the goal, is you don't want to overload one or the other. Now, if you have 3 or 4 or 5 pods, depending on the size of your team, you might want to consider, having a pod per vertical with some growth a potential built in. That's not a bad idea. For the structure of your pod itself, right, or the pods themselves, how many you're going to have and who's going to be in the pods, I think it's first important to figure out where the clients are going to go. Because if you have a tech that is really well versed in this set of clients, you probably want them in a single pod, right? If you don't have that, or the knowledge is pretty well spread out, then I think it's a little bit simpler. But if you have a couple field engineers or primary engineers for some of your biggest clients, they should be in the pod that biggest client lives in. So make sure that you align it that way. Let's say you're going to split into 2 pods and you've got 4 level 1s, 5 level 2s, and a couple level 3s. Then you basically you split your level 1s up. You got 2 and 2. You take your level 2s and you split them up 2 and 2, or 3 and 2, or 2 and 3. And then your level 3s, you either assign one to each pod, or you maybe have a shared services pod. And in fact, that shared services pod worked great for us. So we had our dispatcher in there. We had a couple extra level 2s and a level 3 in there in particular, because they were able to help out either pod if they were ever behind or just needed somebody to escalate to, right? So it worked out quite well to have that sort of shared pod. So you have your pods, you have your level 1s, you have your level 2s, you might have a level 3 or the shared thing. And then you assign the clients into those pods, right? And then you just kind of get rolling with your support. So when it comes to support, I think you don't actually change any of your normal ticket intake stuff, you have a dispatcher for a reason. The phones will ring. You don't give your clients a different number to call because now you're on this team versus that team or versus the whole support team. You make it as simple for your clients as you possibly can, and all of the other stuff kind of happens, once the ticket starts. And once that ticket starts, then that ticket goes to that pod, right? It goes to level ones that work in that pod. They do some initial troubleshooting and they escalate as needed. And you follow your typical escalation procedures, with the exception of if you need to pull in somebody from a different pod or from the shared services pod, you just make sure that there's a process to get that ticket over to them, without it being some major pain in the rear. The last thing I want to talk about as it relates to kind of this team structure and kind of building out the teams within the pods is that your project team needs to go somewhere too. You could have a project engineer or multiple project engineers assigned to a pod. I think that would work well enough if you have enough projects going on. Ultimately, I think that project team is typically well versed enough, malleable enough, and they know enough about all of the different things that they probably live on their own and they go wherever the projects are. I wouldn't get too worried about whether they live in a pod or not. The next question might be, how do you handle your strategic business reviews and some of those kinds of things when you have a pod to work with? Well, it works really great when you have a small team working with a subset of clients where your account manager, whether it's an owner-led account manager situation or you have an account management team or VCIO or whatever the title happens to be, you have them work with that team itself to really understand what's going on, because now they talk to 3 or 4 people or 4 or 5 people, and you really can have some solid conversations about, hey, we're seeing these kind of things, because it's no longer having to talk to 10 or 15 people or whatever. It looks like you're talking to 4 or 5 people or something like that. You can actually really gain some efficiencies there, and it's really incumbent on the account manager and the team to really work together on these things, because I think it's ultimately going to be a benefit to the client. In my other video, I mentioned that adding the next pod can be a bit of a challenge, right? Because if you think of your pod, let's say your pod is typically, 4 or 5 people, that means you have to have enough business to add 4 or 5 new techs. So that means you need to add some business and you put it in the existing pod structure and you hire people as needed, and eventually you split off, right? If you continue to just add more and more techs and more clients to each individual pod, you're going to end up with the same issue that brought you to pods in the first place. The other way could be if you bring on a new really large client, you might make a small pod, maybe one level 1 and one level 2 that kind of live in this other pod, and you add some clients around them. I could see that working as well. The issue there would be that that new client would have to be quite large to support 2 full salaries. You could also do something where you have this one large client and they move over, and in their spare time, they support the other pods, right? They maybe take some overflow tickets and those kinds of things. I could see that working as well. I think it sort of depends on the situation. Typically, though, your MSP isn't adding a bunch of real large clients. Now, if you do, cool. That's not super typical. So if you're adding, smaller clients over time, then you just need to make sure that you have essentially a destination in place for those clients at some point in the future, right? That's kind of the big thing there. I think the last question about pods becomes, how do I get back out of pods? When is it the logical choice? What does that look like, and those kinds of things? Now, I mentioned in the other video, but let's get into a little bit more deeply here, because in order for you to get out of pods, you need to really build a lot of structure and support process and documentation and standardization. Like, it requires a bunch of things that happen in the background in order for you to be able to shift back out of it. Because the last thing you want to do is shift into pods, do that for a while, and then try to shift back out, and then you have to go back into it, right? That's quite the boomerang effect. And that's not a thing that's going to be a good for your team, good for your clients, good for anybody, really. One of the things you really have to have figured out is that support process. You have to get your level 1s to be able to support all of the clients without having to look things up and hem and haw and have to figure things out on the fly where it's obvious to the client that you're figuring things out on the fly. What does that mean? Well, the first thing is you need to have a really solid base level of, this is how we do these tasks across all of the clients, right? You can't have a situation where you're doing password resets the same for 60% of your clients and then the other 40 are some other thing or multiple other things. You can't have user creation be a thing that's completely different amongst all of the different clients. You can't have group management and file permissions and file sharing and remote access. All of that stuff needs to be as straightforward as it possibly can be for every single one of your clients, because that's how your level 1s are able to support all of the kind of the common questions that come in, and then they escalate only the things that need to be escalated. That becomes your number one priority, is to try to build that out. Now, one of the best ways to do that is to essentially re-onboard all of your clients, to kind of go back through and reset these standards and say, okay, I know you've been using this VPN solution for a long time, but this is a better solution. So we're going to shift you over to this, and we're going to train you and do all the things. That could be a project you charge them for it, or maybe it's not. Maybe you say, what, we're going to do this in the sake of giving us some additional flexibility for the long-term on support process. So we're just going to do that. And you just kind of re-onboard all of your different clients, so that way you kind of get everybody to your standards. I think that's a really great way of doing it. It's definitely going to be time consuming. It's going to be a bit of a challenge, but I think it's ultimately going to be the thing that helps you get back out of pods. The second piece is your hardware stack needs to be mostly in line, right? You can't have 15 different firewalls, a mix of 4 or 5 different security stacks. You can't have all the stuff be different, because again, you're trying to make it such that your support team is able to support your clients right off the gate, right? The minute they call in, the minute they open a ticket, your team isn't having to figure out the basic stuff. Now, all of the stuff that's sort of complicated or kind of more challenging, then that's a thing you're gonna have to deal with. But for the most part, it's really all about that common issue that comes in and all of that. Because once you escalate an issue to your level 2s or level 3s, they're often able to figure things out pretty quickly on the fly without impacting the feel of the service for your clients. Because for the most part, level 2s and level 3s are the just figure it out people. It's really, again, it's all about kind of building these standards in. So let's say you're ready to pull a trigger to come back out of pods. It's pretty straightforward. You just flip the switch and you move on. You might let your clients know that you're making some changes to provide them better support, right? And you just give them maybe a little bit of a gloss over what that looks like. I think that's a fair way of doing it. I think pods are a great intermediate stage of your MSP. I think that they become essentially necessary in many cases, because it's really hard to build all those standards when you're growing, especially if you're growing fast. If you're adding new clients left and right, and their processes are kind of all over the place, it's going to take some time and settling down a little bit to be able to build out those standards. So I think it's a great intermediate spot. Ultimately, I think you want to get back out of them at some point, but it doesn't have to happen right away. Thank you for coming on this ramble with me, and hope to see you on the next one. Real quick, right down below this video is the like button. Please go ahead and hit that for me, would you?